Hello and welcome to this webinar with Dr. Simon Lightfoot, co-author of the Politics and IR Companion. Just a couple of points before we begin. Microphones are going to be muted for all attendees just to maintain the sound quality. However, if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask them using the questions or chat box, which you'll see on the toolbar on the side. And don't worry if you missed something, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar after it's finished. I'm now going to pass on to Simon to begin the webinar.
Right, hello, welcome. I'm Simon Lightfoot. As Eleanor said, I'm the co-author of the Politics and IR Companion second edition. The aim of today is to provide some examples from my own experiences of teaching and supervising first year students. So what would be quite helpful is if you could use the chat box to send me your involvement with year one students. Are you working at a school or college and preparing them for university? Are you teaching? Are you running programs? And that'll give me a sense of obviously the audience, but also if there's anything particular that you'd like to discuss or share, then please again use the chat box to do that. I think I've been spending quite a lot of time over the past few years thinking about first year and how important it is and how we need to ensure that we get it right. Doesn't always mean that we will, but I think it is something that is often not as well thought about as it could be. And that goes from who our students are, through what the skills they'll need, through to the key elements. But also one of the things that I think is a real key for me is the way that we'd like to introduce students to the nature of research. So what makes university different from school or college? And I think that nature of research and scholarship and their involvement in it is something that's really important. So the first thing that I think we need to do is be explicit. I spend a lot of time talking to students, and I think a lot of what we do is often implicit, and we need to spell out what the rules of the game are. We need to think about explaining the journey, telling people what they're going to be doing, why they're going to do it, thinking about the language. Clearly, this is important in relation to students from different backgrounds, but also about the general language. Why do some people feel as if it's important to make things complicated? We might be talking about complex issues, but we don't have to necessarily talk about it in a complicated way. And I think that comes back to this notion. It works so much better if you're in a science. My colleagues in chemistry talk about chemists in training or physicists in training, but that's how I think we need to look at our students in politics. Social scientists in training, giving them the training they need to A, complete their degree, but B, also develop the skill sets they'll need to go into the world of employment or future training. And I think that leads us through to the key tool that we need to instill in our students, which is the notion of critical thinking, and being explicit about that, showing how the skill sets that we develop in our students as part of a politics or international relations or combined degree give them that notion of being able to develop the critical thinking skills, and being clear to the students that critical thinking isn't just or isn't criticism. It's about an appreciation of why something has happened, the different ways of thinking about it, being able to appraise and sort of give some sense of how different opinions arrive at different conclusions about the same event, and then coming up to their own voice, which I think is, again, part of the journey. It's getting the students to find their own voice. But to do that, we need to know who they are. And I think this is something that, again, I realized relatively recently, which is a little bit embarrassing, that I wasn't really sure what the students had come to us with. So what do their qualifications look like? What does an A-level look like in the UK? How has it changed since I was a student or I was a pupil? And how is it changing? So the notions of things like essay questions are really important, because do students have experience of writing essays? What is their educational experience like? So that is something that trying to spend a bit more time thinking about, talking to the students about. It isn't just about whether they have politics A-level or politics as part of any leaving certificate. It's about the notion of those qualifications. What skills do they test? How are students tested? How do they learn? What type of support do they have? And clearly that leads into questions around where are they from? So are they local students, local depending on how you define that, but are they from the locality around the university? Have they travelled? Are they living away from home? Are they commuting into university? Are they international? All of these issues, I think, are really important, because the first year is the first thing that they're going to encounter. And so therefore, it may be that for a lot of the students, things like getting familiar with the city, getting familiar with living on their own, getting familiar with just being an independent learner, an independent human actually, are actually going to be the key things. And that needs to be borne in mind when we're approaching them with the academic side of life. Obviously, we need to know if politics is their main or IR is their main degree. So again, I'm often teaching students who are doing politics in conjunction with a language or in conjunction with history. Some of my students are actually taking this as what we call at Leeds a discovery module. So their main degree may be something completely different. So trying to manage that diversity and work out strategies is really important. And what experiences do they have of politics IR? So again, that could be an educational experience, but it could also be a broader notion of their involvement in politics or work experience, and trying to at least understand who these people are gives you a sense of being able to know how to pitch things, gives you a sense of how to actually ensure that they are able to relate to the academic content. So I think sort of either doing your own research, so I've often done sort of post-it notes, even with 300 students, where you get the sense of what are their expectations, what are their fears. There's an interesting piece of research here that interviews students and gives you a sense of the their expectations, what's their reality, what are they worried about, what are their maybe fears. And again, if you look through these types of reports, it's clear that there's a number of academic concerns that they often have, often, in my opinion, or in my experience, often around plagiarism. But, how are they going to make friends? How are they going to settle in? All of those elements are really important. And again, we need to build those into the first few weeks. I think we need to get students working quite quickly into what they've come to university to study, but at the same time, we also need to be aware of the fact that for a lot of these students, they are going to be dealing with issues around living away from home and things like that. So there's a bit of research here from different places. There's a really nice example from the UK, where Alistair Blair at De Montfort University has done some research about student expectations, about feedback and assessment. There's some examples from Ireland where there's been some work done on this, and some examples from South Africa, again, just thinking about the different contexts. And one of the things that we also get students to do is be aware of their own political views. So there are other options, but I quite like Political Compass. It's quite a simple way of getting students to just identify their political persuasions, and to try and get them to at least be prepared to acknowledge what they are, and to be open to the fact that at university they're going to hear a diversity of views, and part of the notion of academic debate is having respect for those views, even if you don't obviously agree with them. So I think over the years I'm thinking more and more about what do students really need to know, and when do they need to know it. And I think this leads me in quite a lot to thinking about the content versus process. I have had lots of courses where you plan out huge amounts of content, and perhaps I think less about the delivery, think less about whether all of that content is really necessary. I've worked in a number of different universities in the UK, got experience of different UK universities, and I think often students coming to university are relatively good at getting the information. It's then what do they do with it? And so trying to think about this in relation to things like the sort of notions of threshold concepts, and what are the major concepts you want your students to go away with, what are the most important concepts that they will need in terms of future studies, both in terms of modules, but also in terms of how the program develops. And that's led me to sort of question my own role. So the classic cliche is you perform that role of the sage on the stage. So you're talking to 300 students and you're trying to think about whether that is the most important role all of the time, or whether you should be trying to guide them. Clearly the notion of mass higher education makes that trickier, but thinking about these kind of relationships and the notion of what people need to know is really important. And then also, what do people need in relation to assessment? So how much assessment, what do we need to assess? How can we assess students? These are a lot of the questions that I'm thinking about at the moment in relation to particularly the how much assessment, and particularly around the research around the sort of mental health issues of students, the pressure that they feel, the journey that they've been on before they come to university. So thinking about the how much assessment, I think, is also quite important. And we often, I think, over assess our students, and therefore going back to actually, well, what do we need our students to evidence, and how can we use assessment to do that, I think is really important. I think moving on, the thing that I've always tried to do, and I think a lot of people do, but it's can get a little bit lost in the way that level one is that, you know, students are often coming in full of enthusiasm for study, and then some of the research suggests that they're a little bit disappointed. You know, so often students may have done something like EPQ or extended project qualification, and then they find that the nature of sort of answering sort of prescribed essay questions a little bit dull. They're also perhaps coming in with an excitement about the contemporary nature of the subject, so it could be something that we think about too much in the UK, or so much in the UK, is something like Brexit, or the hashtag Me Too, or the rise of China. And I wonder whether we can make more of that in terms of the notion of the contemporary examples, and capturing both the enthusiasm of the students and the nation of the sort of the changing nature of the subject. I went to university during the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so to sort of have that, studying that transition from communism to an alternative form of, or alternative system was something that was really quite an exciting period of time. I know of somebody who was having to answer an exam question about Chinese politics on the day of Tiananmen Square. And so again, sort of this is the sort of nature of the subject, and we need to convey that excitement and enthusiasm to the students, but also show them how they can still approach it from an academic sense. And some of the things that I also think is that perhaps we can use different media to capture that. So we often were asked by students, what should I read before coming to university? And they were talking about different textbooks. So we put together a pre-arrival reading list of books like The Handmaid's Tale or 1984, just to get students to be thinking about what they would be doing at university and how different ways of approaching the subject give you different insights. You could be talking about foreign policy analysis in a course, and that often Alison in particular uses the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We weren't around then. It may not be the most historically accurate, but 13 Days as a film can be used, for example, to capture what happened and get students to understand that as a supplement. For some students, the new literature on zombies and international relations theory might be a way of actually capturing their enthusiasm. And obviously, again, you know, getting students to be thinking about the use of blogs and Twitter and other social media in terms of the way that they're used in politics, the way that they inform political debate, I think is really important. This notion of scaffolding knowledge, I think, is key. Looking back at the journey, you know, thinking about why we're doing the things that we're doing. I often this year have been looking back, so from a specialist final year module, trying to ensure that students understand how this builds upon their second year and first year courses, how they are bringing a notion of expertise to the module. It may not be exactly the same, so some students will have done different courses, therefore they bring different experiences. And again, this is trying to convey that notion of A, their own knowledge, but also B, their ability to learn from their peers, and to stop, I think, seeing individual courses or modules as a sort of siloed issue, which can be problematic in terms of things like feedback. Well, I've finished the comparative political parties course, that's done, I've got my mark, I'm moving on. Whereas actually, you need to understand how the knowledge in that will inform, say, a course on right-wing parties, or will inform your other work if you look at the feedback on your assessments. And I think that sense of research and enthusiasm is really important. You know, try and show students that academics disagree, show that different methodologies ask different questions. There's a really excellent book, The Ways of Knowing, that again I find as a really good introduction to the different methodologies and how that gets you to think differently. Try and, if you're research or scholarship active, try and show how that benefits the students. So, you know, I try and share the research from conferences I go, try and share conference papers, get students to read it, those types of things, partly to show, as we're going to see later on, that what I produce that appears in a journal it's obviously the finished article, but that's the piece of long work. It may have been 2 years, it may have been 12, 13, 15, 20 rewrites, and just get them to understand the notion of the discipline. And what we do here is that, you know, we can use examples like this excellent one from Lamont, where he outlines the ways that different types of research methods give you different types of questions in relation to researching something like the Arab Spring. You can then use debates within the academic debates to identify the fact that different academics disagree, how they disagree. I mean, this is a very specific one around the genocide in Rwanda, but there's others that we highlight in the book about things like, is Mrs. Thatcher really radical? Again, this may not be appropriate at the beginning of the course, but towards the end of a course, you can start to identify the fact that different academics have different views. Why do they interpret very similar events in different ways? Is it because of an ideological position, a methodological position? And I think getting students to understand this gives them that notion of grey within academic debates, and I think that's really important. The way that they do that is obviously by using the library, by using the internet, and so I picked up quite quickly that this may not be something. Very few schools have libraries. Very few colleges have the libraries at the level of a university. So get them to use it, get them to realise, get them to think very carefully about how they use the library. I can sometimes feel a little bit patronising, but I think this is about the sense of actually saying to people, this is how you use the social media or Google Scholar or whatever in an academic way. And I think that allows everyone to be on the same page when it comes to issues around starting off and making sure that everyone's there. So again, it depends on the nature of the course, but get students used to using primary data. Try and introduce them early on to statistics. I'm not necessarily that comfortable with statistics, but I try and use them to show that you shouldn't be afraid of them, to realise how different people use the primary data, how it can be interpreted differently. And I think this leads me on to something that I thought about quite a lot. How much do I tell students? So this is a slide from an introductory lecture to the European Union, and this is talking about the role of COREPER, the permanent representatives, sort of the civil servants of the member states, and their role in the European Union. And so we tell them about the different structures, and I'm never quite sure whether this is the right way to do it. So again, going back to the notion of threshold concepts, do I need to give them all this information, or do I show them? So there's a really good video here. To what extent should I try and take students on a field trip? Or could I run a simulation? So these are the sort of challenges that I confront in my own delivery, and I don't necessarily know that there is one answer. I am trying to perhaps use things like the video first, so pre-lecture reading or viewing. Then I can talk about it. Do I need the level of detail? Am I there trying to show the students around the sort of political challenge that comes with the notion of the European Union as a intergovernmental or a sui generis body, but trying to work out what do I need to do? And again, that can often be dictated by the size of the audience. It can be dictated by the room. So do I need to tell students what the powers of the British Prime Minister are, or can we get them to discuss it in groups and feedback, and then we can move the lecture on? Again, that works if you've got that kind of room, but often you'll find that you're talking to students in lecture theatres with row after row after row. So again, trying to think around the delivery, trying to ensure that we know how students read. So when I first started as an academic, the notion was you just produced a reading list, and evidence from the library seemed to suggest that students would start with the one at the top and work their way down, and that would produce dissatisfaction. We'd only have one text in the library, and then there would be a lot of demand for it. And it made me think, based on student feedback, well, what do I need them to do? And actually, for some modules, what I've tried to do is give them one text. This is the text that you will read. Everyone will read it. Everything, particularly if it's thought about, it's always a journal article. Everyone will get access to it. And then one of the things that we can do is show them how from that article you can get more sources from looking at Google Scholar, or you can start to actually get them to deal with this sort of working hard, which is the notion I often get from students. I was working hard, I was in the library for 17 hours, versus the working smart. Well, what were you doing? What were you reading? How were you making sure that the material that you were reading was relevant? And so again, getting them to actually read articles, identify the core arguments, work out what this article is saying, how it links into the literature. All of these things, I think, again, by being explicit to the student, we help them ensure that they've got the skills that they need. So there's a few other ideas. Some places have set up reading groups where everyone is reading the same article or book, and that can be quite nice to break down the barriers between sort of different levels of student, make students feel part of a community. Show them your work, make sure they understand the redrafting. The WD-40 is there because someone pointed this out to me, that its name is water displacement 40, so it's the 40th version of the formula that was used. And if you go on the WD-40 website, you will see this sense of the history. And so therefore, we're often presenting to students things in a finished form, but we need to encourage them to redraft, to make sure that they're not just looking at the first thing they write becomes the thing that they submit. And to use the politics and international relations example, thought this was lovely when I found this. This was, I think it was Benjamin Franklin's edits of the United States Constitution. And so we have grown up with this idea that the United States Constitution, we hold these truths to be self-evident. But as you can see from the screen, in the initial draft, it was something else, and that's been crossed out, and the self-evident has been added. So even something as significant as an American Constitution has gone through numbers of drafts. So making this part of the conversation with your students sounds really obvious, but actually we do need to explain to students that this is something that they will be doing. We obviously as academics need to be clear about whether we will read drafts, comment on drafts, but getting students into that mindset of planning and starting their work earlier is something that's really important. And so I also try now to build in time. So building time for reflection. So one of the things we've tried are things like look back weeks, where after a period perhaps of notions around theories, you then have a week where everything looks back and we review those theories, possibly look at case studies and how different theories would understand them. Just something that allows students a moment to catch up, to make sure that they understand it. And so therefore we also try and find ways for including the student voice. So there are obviously technological solutions like Mentimeter, where people can ask questions, or clickers where you can ask questions and check that students understand. You can find ways of using blended learning to get anonymous questions where students may be a little bit reluctant to ask, or even just something along the lines of the good old-fashioned post-it note. What's working for you, what's not working. All of those things I think are important. So looking at what technology can offer, one of the things that I try and do is encourage my students to build up their own reading lists. Not finding very many opportunities. The technology doesn't always seem to work the way I want it to, but looking at how you can be more engaged with your students around their own learning, to again encourage them to be independent, to give them the skills to allow them to be independent. And so here are some of the examples that I've done. Hopefully those of you who are there might be willing to share some of your top tips. There's a first year experience conference where people from across particularly Europe come together to talk about this. You've got a list of articles on a whole range of political science topics that can be found on this iPad, which I've found as to be a really brilliant way of actually getting into and getting the kind of evidence base that I'd need for some of my own research. So and particularly, again, I've found useful to go and get experience from others. So whatever people might be doing, often in very random places. So some experiences from computing first year students, you've sort of thought, okay, I can't take that example, but actually the ethos or the aim behind it is something that I can do in my own work. So hopefully these are some of the things that we've been trying at different, particularly at Leeds over the last few years. Some extent they work, some extent they don't. I think I've been trying lots of different ways, but I think the most important thing for me is that I want my students to set off on the journey with the right skill sets. One of the things that I found slightly depressing was talking to a student once at graduation who said that, I've just worked it out. And you're thinking, if they'd just worked it out a few weeks before graduation, okay, they did well, but what could they have achieved if that had been clear to them from the start? And I think my own experience of talking to the students is they often think that there are implicit rules of a game that they are not aware of. And I'm not sure there are. I just think sometimes we don't do as good a job as we could about explicitly setting out what they are, what our expectations are, what skills that they're developing, etc. And so if anything else, one of the things that I try and do is just make sure that I do that in all of my activities with the students. So happy to answer any questions, happy to receive any tips. Obviously I've shared some of mine, it'd be quite nice to get other people's tips. So I'll open it up to whoever's there.
So just one question, Simon. So what do you find what do you think your students find the most challenging when they're beginning the course?
I think they find the expectation for independent study the most challenging, and they are worried. So every time I've done sort of mini surveys with the students, it's really clear they're worried about how they're going to manage their time, how they're going to find the information. I think most of the time they're relatively confident that they will be able to manage the sort of intellectual challenge. I think it's just that notion of the expectation. So again, we spend quite a lot of time with them explaining how to write an essay, what is a good introduction, how do you go about finding your voice, presenting your own, presenting the material in a particular way. I think there is a notion, I think, that they think academic writing has to be complicated. So that notion again, so I'm reading drafts of student work and thinking you wouldn't speak like that. So, why are you presenting the work in such a way that makes it hard to actually understand what your meaning is? So those are some of the key things. And again, I think if you go back to some of these research on expectations, and particularly the expectations reality research is quite interesting, where they do surveys about what students think before they go to university and then what they get there. And actually, a lot of the stuff around courses being hard or them not being able to cope seems to be less of an issue around it is more around these sort of study skills. And yet often these are the areas we perhaps aren't as good at, and it's a constant discussion I have with colleagues around, well, I can't do that, I can't include that issue about essay writing in the module because I need to cover this content. And I can't always work out whether the content is what they need or whether, well, actually, I know what they need. They don't need the content. The content, they can come from somewhere else. But actually, it's the skills that they need and the support to set them up on the right foundations for the rest of their studies. Because again, when you get your study skills right at level 1, and you start to get good marks and you start to, you know, really get enjoyment out of doing this, you can see that carrying through a lot more into their final year dissertations. For students who struggle, it can often be quite a challenge.
Thank you. Also, you mentioned a few different kind of strategies that you've been trying out. I was just wondering which have you found the most effective?
It's really interesting because you get the module feedback at the end of the module, and particularly for the study skills stuff, and you get some students going, this is the most boring thing I've ever done. And then you get other students saying, I'm really glad someone's told me. So I do think it does depend, and so I do take a position that you know, I am willing to to try and talk to the students who have done some of this stuff before, who find it boring, and actually try and explain to them. But I think, you know, making sure that everyone is on the same page, and then that's obviously where a lot of first year teaching sits, in terms of giving everyone the introduction to comparative politics, introduction to international relations, introduction to political theory, introduction to methodology. We're all trying to give the students the foundations, knowing that some of our students may have done history at A level or politics as part of a pre-university course. And so we need to try and work that out. I think the thing, again, that is restricted in terms of things like timetable, but trying to get students as involved in their own research as possible. So again, we've not tried this at Leeds because of the demands, but things like problem-based learning or inquiry-based learning, again, I think some of the students find that challenging, but trying to introduce elements of that in your own work is important. And again, that can come down to a level 1 essay where you ask students to apply theories to a contemporary case or something like that. So don't always work. I think one of the things that I've realized is that, you know, it's partly about delivery, it's partly about the examples. I need to think about those more carefully. Some of the things that I've found really helpful is getting second year students to say, this is what wish I'd known as a first year student. And I think, you know, that was much easier than getting, you know, whatever I think. I'm not anywhere close to the students anymore in terms of age or interests or outlook on life, and so getting someone else to convey these messages was really quite helpful.
Thank
So
you.
someone's asked about the learning requirements. Yes. I would think that in my experience within the British system and within the A-level system is that, and connected to the fee regime, there has been a greater demand for students in relation to sort of, if you like, provide them with not necessarily the answers, but, you know, what do I need to read? What do I need to do? For some of the students, there's been a growth in a very strategic mindset around completing assessments and therefore doing as well as possible in those to ensure they get the good degree. So that's been a bit of a challenge about getting students to read around this topic, to engaging things like unassessed presentations, building up their skills. But I think trying to explain to them how that works is really important, to try and work with them from their A level, where a lot of students will have never done essays or long pieces of writing, and helping them with that. One of the things that worked when I worked at Liverpool John Moores in the 1990s was that we would get students to do sort of drafts and comment on those drafts separate from the content, if you like. So it worked quite well to some extent, where you could actually sort of penalise students in relation to things like poor essay writing style in one module, but then actually, the content was able to be marked in a different module. And for some students that worked really well, because the disaggregation or the aggregation of the two into one particular place, I think that some of them found hard, and they couldn't quite work out, I know what I'm talking about. Yes, you do, but actually here are the things that you need to improve upon. And I think that sort of sense is really important. But again, that also comes back to my own notions of thinking about what I write on students' assessment. So for a long time, I would write things like, your referencing isn't very good. And then they'd come back to me and say, well, what's wrong with my referencing? And highlight they've used Harvard. And what I meant was not the technicalities of referencing, but what they weren't really doing was using evidence well to support their arguments. So by changing my own feedback, I became clearer to the students about what was expected. And so, again, that helped the students in their own requirements. They started to realise what was expected of being at university, and therefore by thinking about the language I was using, I was able to be more helpful in relation to what was expected of them.
Thank you. And lastly, how can instructors, or how do you recommend instructors use the Politics and IR companion within their course?
I think it's designed as particularly from its initial first edition, as a one-stop shop. And I think that has got some attractions in terms of students having something that covers probably all the things that they would expect to find as a sort of a first-year student, from introduction to international relations right the way through to something about study skills. But they should use this as a way of sparking interest in reading around the subject, realizing that a lot of what's talked about in the book is introducing them to these fundamentally contested concepts, realizing that the focus on who's writing things. So there's an example in the book where you look at a piece of academic writing, and then you start realizing what was the author's ideological position, how does that influence what they're researching, how does an author's methodological position influence what they're researching, and just get students to be more critically aware of the material that they're coming across. And again, same with things like the internet. I wouldn't necessarily know what the Freedom Foundation stood for, so therefore I would want to do a bit more research into its ideological, political position before citing it in an academic article. And so getting students to just have that critical awareness of the things that they're coming across would be really helpful to build on the companion, but knowing that the sorts of things that we've contained within the companion are things that at least give them some confidence about moving forward in terms of their journey as independent learners.
Great, thank you. And that seems to be all the questions.
Great.
Great, okay. Thank you very much, Simon. And if you do want to find out more about the Politics and IR companion, you can do so at the link there, and you can also order an inspection copy. And yeah, thank you again, Simon. That was really interesting, and I hope you found it useful as well.
And I've got my email address at the start of the slides in case anyone wants to ask any questions offline. So
great. Thank you. Yes, and we will be sending out a recording of the webinar and also the webinar slides.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, bye.